My adult son and daughter laughed when I said I'd marry at 68, then I sent the invites. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. Thank you very much. Now, let us go back to our main character. Mom, that's embarrassing. Daniel Whitmore's laugh came first, sharp and effortless, cutting across the Sunday dinner table before Margaret could even set down her wineglass. Claire stared at her mother for 2 stunned seconds, then covered her mouth as another laugh escaped. Wait. You're serious? She asked. Margaret Whitmore sat perfectly still at the head of the oak dining table she had owned for 34 years. At 68, she had learned that silence could reveal more about people than arguments ever did. She looked at Daniel, her 43-year-old son, then at Claire, her 40-year-old daughter. Both were still smiling as though their mother had announced she was joining a rock band instead of getting married. Yes, Margaret said. I'm serious. Thomas asked me Saturday morning. I said yes. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed a hand across his face. You're actually planning a wedding? That's generally what comes after an engagement. Margaret's voice remained calm. Claire's smile disappeared first. Mom, come on. You're 68. The number landed strangely. Not because Margaret was ashamed of it. She wasn't. She had earned every year. But Claire said 68 as though it were a diagnosis, a boundary line beyond which excitement became inappropriate. Daniel gave a short laugh. What do you even need a wedding for at your age? Margaret's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, then relaxed. Outside the dining room windows, late October leaves moved across the lawn in the cold Pennsylvania wind. Inside, the roast chicken was cooling between them. 40 years of family life seemed compressed into that table: birthday candles, report cards, college applications, Christmas mornings, arguments, apologies. Margaret had spent decades making sure Daniel and Claire always knew they had a place there. Tonight, somehow, they were deciding whether she still had a place in her own future. I don't need a wedding, Margaret said. I want one. Claire exchanged a glance with her brother. Margaret caught it immediately. That silent communication siblings developed as children had survived into middle age. Thomas is 70, Claire said carefully. Don't you think this is all moving a little fast? We've been together almost 3 years. That's not what she means, Daniel said. Margaret turned toward him. Then what does she mean? Daniel hesitated. For the first time, the humor left his face. She means you should think about how this looks. Margaret almost smiled. How what looks? Mom. Claire lowered her voice, as if embarrassment could be controlled by volume. A big wedding. Invitations. Walking down an aisle. All of it. People are going to talk. People talked when I married your father at 24. That was different. Why? Neither child answered immediately. And there it was. The truth neither wanted to say plainly. At 24, Margaret had been allowed a beginning. At 68, they expected her to accept an ending. Daniel pushed his plate away. We're not trying to hurt you. We're asking you to think about the family. Margaret studied the son whose first apartment deposit she had quietly covered when he was 26, then the daughter whose children she had picked up from school twice a week for 6 years. Family. She knew that word better than either of them realized. I am thinking about my family, she said. Claire softened slightly. Good. Then maybe don't send anything yet. Just give this some time. Margaret looked down at her left hand. The ring Thomas had given her was simple, elegant, and chosen without spectacle. When he had asked her, he hadn't promised to make her young again. He had promised to share whatever years remained. That was precisely why she had said yes. Daniel stood and reached for his jacket. Just don't do anything impulsive, okay? Margaret lifted her eyes to him. Something inside her had gone very quiet. Not broken. Clear. Her children thought they were protecting her from a foolish decision. They had no idea they had just made one of their own. Don't worry, Margaret said. I won't do anything impulsive. Claire seemed relieved. Daniel nodded as if the matter had been settled. Neither noticed Margaret glance toward the small writing desk in the living room, where a cream-colored box sat beneath the lamp. Inside were 84 wedding invitations, already printed, already addressed, waiting only for stamps. Margaret looked back at her children. But Daniel, she said quietly, you should understand something. He paused at the doorway. What's that? Margaret held his gaze. I said I'm thinking about my family. I didn't say I needed my family's permission. The front door closed behind Daniel and Claire at 7:42 that evening, and Margaret remained at the dining table long after their headlights disappeared beyond the maple trees. The house became quiet again. She knew that quiet well. For 39 years, Robert Whitmore had filled these rooms with small sounds she had once taken for granted, the morning newspaper folding beside his coffee, baseball games murmuring from the den, his keys landing in the ceramic bowl by the door. When Robert died 6 years earlier, silence arrived almost overnight. Margaret had been 62. Everyone told her how strong she was. Daniel handled paperwork. Claire brought casseroles. Friends called every afternoon. Then weeks became months, and life resumed for everyone except the woman waking alone in a king-sized bed. Margaret learned to carry groceries into the house by herself. She learned which floorboards creaked at midnight. She learned that loneliness was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply making too much coffee because your hands still remembered 2 cups. She never blamed her children. Daniel had a demanding career and a family of his own. Claire was raising 2 children while working full-time. Margaret became the dependable one again. She remembered birthdays. She hosted Thanksgiving. She drove 40 minutes to pick up Claire's children when schedules collapsed. When Daniel needed help with the deposit on his first serious investment property, Margaret quietly transferred the money and never mentioned it again. Being needed gave her days structure, but being needed was not the same as being seen. Then, almost 3 years ago, Thomas Bennett walked into the community library carrying 2 mystery novels and arguing politely with the librarian about an overdue fine of 80 cents. Margaret had been standing behind him. Thomas turned, saw her trying not to laugh, and said, I believe I am being financially ruined. She laughed anyway. That was how it began. Thomas was 70 now, a retired civil engineer with silver hair, careful manners, and a habit of arriving 10 minutes early for everything. He had been married for 41 years before losing his wife, Susan. He never tried to compete with Robert's memory, and Margaret never asked him to erase Susan. They understood something younger people sometimes struggle to understand. Loving someone new did not require deleting the person who came before. Their relationship grew slowly. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became Saturday drives through Lancaster County. Thomas fixed nothing in Margaret's life because Margaret had never asked to be fixed. He simply noticed her. He asked what she wanted before making plans. He listened when she spoke. Most importantly, he never treated her age like a countdown clock. The previous Saturday morning, they had been sitting on Margaret's back porch beneath 2 blankets, drinking coffee while the temperature hovered near 45 degrees. Thomas had reached into his coat pocket and placed a small ring box between their mugs. No restaurant. No audience. No performance. Margaret, he had said, I do not want to make you young again. I want to grow older beside you. She had stared at him until her eyes filled. Then she said yes. Now, 2 days later, she stood alone in her dining room remembering her children's laughter. Her phone buzzed on the table. Thomas. She answered. How did dinner go? He asked. Margaret looked toward the cream-colored invitation box in the next room. They laughed. Silence came through the phone, but Thomas did not rush to fill it. I am sorry, he finally said. Do you want me to talk to them? No. Her answer came immediately. This is not yours to fix. Another pause. Are you having second thoughts? Margaret walked toward the writing desk and rested her fingertips on the box. About marrying you? No. For the first time that evening, she smiled. About what my children think they are entitled to decide for me? Yes. Across town, Daniel was already calling Claire. Neither knew that their laughter had not changed Margaret's decision. It had only changed what she was beginning to understand about them. By Tuesday morning, Margaret understood that Daniel and Claire had not gone home to think. They had gone home to investigate. Daniel called at 8:15, just as Margaret was pouring coffee. His voice carried the careful patience people used when they had already decided they were the reasonable one. Mom, I need to ask you something about Thomas. Margaret set the coffee pot down. Good morning to you too, Daniel. He ignored the correction. Does he know what the house is worth? Margaret looked around the kitchen Robert and she had renovated 20 years earlier. Probably. Home values are public information. Does he know about Dad's retirement accounts? Why would that be your concern? A pause followed. Daniel lowered his voice. Because somebody has to ask these questions. Margaret felt something cold settle behind her ribs. I am capable of asking my own questions. Daniel sighed. Nobody said you were not. But that was exactly what he was saying. 20 minutes after that call ended, Claire called. She took a different approach. Softer. More emotional. Mom, I barely know Thomas. You have had dinner with him at least 12 times. Dinner is not marriage. Neither is interrogation. Claire went quiet. Then came the sentence Margaret had been waiting for. Have you talked about your will? Margaret closed her eyes. There it was. Not flowers. Not vows. Not whether Thomas made her happy. The will. Yes, Margaret said. Thomas and I have discussed finances. And they are private. Claire sounded wounded. Private from your own children? Margaret looked through the window at the bird feeder Thomas had helped her hang the previous spring. Especially when my children start acting like beneficiaries before they act like family. Claire ended the call soon afterward. Margaret hoped that would be the end of it. It was not. By Wednesday, Daniel had searched Thomas online. He found Thomas's old engineering firm, his previous address, his late wife's obituary, and a county property record showing that Thomas had sold his home 2 years earlier. Daniel sent the information to Claire with a message asking why a man who had sold a house needed to marry a woman who owned one. Claire replied that they needed to protect their mother before she made a mistake. Neither realized that Claire's 22-year-old daughter, Emily, was sitting at the kitchen island when Daniel called that evening. Claire put the phone on speaker while sorting groceries. I am telling you, Daniel said, she is lonely. She does not know what she is doing. Emily stopped scrolling on her phone. Claire glanced toward her, then turned the volume down, but not quickly enough. Uncle Daniel said Grandma does not know what she is doing? Emily asked. This is an adult conversation. I am 22. You know what I mean. Emily watched her mother carefully. Does Grandma seem confused to you? Claire opened the refrigerator. That is not the point. Then what is the point? Claire placed a carton of milk on the shelf harder than necessary. We are trying to make sure she is protected. From Thomas? From making a decision she might regret. Emily stared at her mother. She raised 2 children, managed Grandpa's estate after he died, owns her house, handles her own money, and somehow she suddenly cannot make decisions because she wants to get married? Claire turned. You are too young to understand. Emily gave a small, humorless smile. So I am too young, and Grandma is too old. That is convenient. Across town, Margaret knew nothing about that conversation. She was sitting beside Thomas at a small Italian restaurant, listening as he described 3 possible venues for their wedding. He stopped halfway through and studied her face. "You are somewhere else tonight." Margaret folded her napkin carefully. "Daniel asked about my house. Claire asked about my will." Thomas's expression changed, but his voice remained gentle. "Do they think I want your money?" "I think they are trying very hard to call this concern." Thomas reached toward her hand, then stopped, giving her the choice. Margaret placed her hand over his. "I spent years teaching them to speak for themselves," she said. "I never imagined they would grow up and decide they could speak for me." Her phone lit up on the table. A message from Emily. "Grandma, can I come over tomorrow? Just you and me." Margaret read it twice. Something in those 6 words felt different from every conversation she had endured that week. She typed back immediately. "Of course." What Margaret did not know was that Emily was no longer coming just to visit. She was coming because she had heard exactly what her mother and uncle really thought. Emily arrived Thursday afternoon carrying 2 coffees and an expression Margaret recognized immediately. It was the same expression Claire had worn as a teenager whenever she knew something important but was not sure how to say it. Margaret opened the door before Emily could knock twice. "You brought bribery," Margaret said, eyeing the cardboard drink carrier. "Vanilla latte. 2 pumps. Extra hot." You remembered. "Grandma, you have ordered the same thing since I was 12. Margaret smiled and let her inside. They settled at the kitchen table, where sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor and the house felt warmer than it had all week. Emily talked about work for several minutes, then about a friend who was moving to Philadelphia. Margaret let her take her time. Finally Emily wrapped both hands around her cup. "Are you happy?" Margaret blinked. "That is a surprisingly serious question for coffee." "I mean with Thomas." Margaret studied her granddaughter. There was no mockery in Emily's face. No suspicion. Just concern without judgment. "Yes," Margaret said. "I am." Emily nodded slowly. "Like actually happy?" Margaret leaned back. "For the first time in years, I wake up looking forward to tomorrow." The word surprised even her. She had not realized how true they were until she heard them aloud. Emily's eyes softened. "Then why are Mom and Uncle Daniel acting like you joined a cult?" Margaret almost laughed. "I was hoping you had come here without knowing about that. I heard Uncle Daniel on speakerphone." Margaret's smile disappeared. Emily hesitated. "He said you were lonely. He said you did not know what you were doing." The kitchen seemed to lose its warmth. Margaret looked down at her coffee. Hearing the word secondhand somehow hurt more than hearing questions about her house or her will. Money could be defended with documents. Competence was different. "Your mother agreed?" Margaret asked. Emily chose her answer carefully. She did not disagree. Margaret turned toward the window. 6 years earlier, after Robert's funeral, Daniel had stood in this same kitchen unable to understand an insurance form. Margaret had explained every page. Claire had been too overwhelmed to organize the memorial reception, so Margaret had done that too. She had buried her husband and still remembered who needed gluten-free food. Nobody had questioned her judgment then. "They think they are protecting me," Margaret said. "Do you?" Emily asked. Margaret looked at her. "No. I think they are frightened." "Of Thomas?" "Of change." Margaret took a slow breath. "For years, I have been predictable. Their mother. Their children's grandmother. The person who hosts holidays and answers the telephone when something goes wrong. Thomas reminds them that I have a life they do not control." Emily was silent for a moment. "That is not fair." "Fairness is easier to recognize when you are not the one losing control." Emily reached across the table. "Grandma, I need you to know something. If you want this wedding, I am coming." Margaret's eyes filled before she could stop them. "Even if your mother does not?" "Especially if Mom decides your happiness needs a committee vote." Margaret laughed softly. Then Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. "What is it?" Margaret asked. Emily turned the phone over. "Mom." "Answer it." Emily did. Claire did not bother with small talk. "Are you at Grandma's?" "Yes." "Good. Tell her Daniel and I are coming over Saturday morning. We need to have a serious family conversation." Margaret could hear every word from across the table. Emily's jaw tightened. "Why does Grandma need your permission to be happy?" Silence filled the line. Then Claire said, "Emily, stay out of this." Emily looked directly at Margaret. "No. You keep saying Grandma is too old to understand and I am too young to understand. Funny how you are the only age that gets to make decisions." Claire's voice hardened. Saturday. 10 o'clock. The call ended. Margaret remained still. Emily looked worried. "I am sorry." Margaret shook her head. "Do not be." She picked up her coffee and took one calm sip. "Actually, Saturday is perfect." "For what?" Margaret's gaze drifted toward the cream-colored box on the writing desk. "Your mother and uncle want a serious family conversation," she said. It is time they had one. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with rain tapping softly against Margaret's kitchen windows. At exactly 10 o'clock, Daniel and Claire walked through the front door together. That alone told Margaret this was not a conversation. It was a presentation. Daniel carried a dark blue folder beneath one arm. Claire held her purse tightly against her side. Thomas was already there, seated in the living room with a cup of coffee, but when Daniel noticed him, his expression changed. "We wanted to talk to Mom privately." Thomas started to stand. Margaret raised one hand. "Thomas stays." Daniel exhaled. "Mom, please do not make this difficult." Margaret almost admired the sentence. They had entered her house uninvited, carrying a folder about her future, and somehow she was the one making things difficult. She sat in Robert's old armchair and folded her hands. "Go ahead." Daniel opened the folder on the coffee table. Inside were printed pages, financial notes, property records, and information about Thomas's former home. Claire leaned forward. "We are not attacking you. We love you." "Then this should be easy to hear," Margaret said. Claire continued. "We think you should postpone the wedding for 6 months." Margaret said nothing. Daniel pulled out another sheet. "And before you marry, we think you need an independent financial review. Your house, Dad's retirement assets, your investments, everything." Thomas shifted slightly. "Daniel, Margaret and I have already discussed separate property and estate planning." Daniel looked at him. "This is family business." Thomas opened his mouth, but Margaret spoke first. "Thomas." He turned toward her. "Please." He understood immediately and leaned back. Margaret looked at Daniel. "Continue." Daniel seemed encouraged by her calmness. "I also think it would make sense for me to help manage some of your larger financial decisions temporarily." There it was. Not advice anymore. Authority. Margaret stared at the son she had once taught to balance a checking account at the same kitchen table 25 years earlier. "You want to manage my money. I want to protect it." "From whom?" Daniel glanced at Thomas. The answer was obvious. Claire stepped in quickly. "Nobody is accusing anyone. We just think emotions can affect judgment." Margaret's eyes moved to her daughter. "Whose emotions?" Claire looked away. Rain traced thin lines down the window. Margaret remembered Daniel at 19, calling home after midnight because he had chosen the wrong college major and believed his life was ruined. She had listened for 2 hours. She remembered Claire at 32, exhausted with a newborn, crying at this same table while Margaret promised that asking for help did not make her weak. Every time her children had been uncertain, Margaret had treated them with dignity. Now they had mistaken her happiness for incompetence. Have either of you asked me whether Thomas makes me happy? She said. Neither answered. Have you asked what kind of ceremony I want? Where we plan to live? What I am excited about? Claire's face softened. Mom, that is not the issue. Exactly. Margaret's voice remained quiet. The issue is that I made a decision without consulting you. Daniel closed the folder. Because this decision affects all of us. How? You know how. No, Daniel. Say it. His patience finally cracked. Fine. What happens to this house? What happens to Dad's money? What happens if Thomas gets everything and we spend years cleaning up a mistake you made because you were lonely? The room went still. Thomas lowered his eyes. Claire whispered, Daniel. But he was not finished. Someone has to be realistic. Dad built this life with you. Margaret stood slowly. Your father and I built this life together. Then maybe you should think about what he would want. Margaret's face changed. Daniel saw it, but too late. Dad would be ashamed of this. Even the rain seemed quieter. For one suspended moment, Margaret was back beside Robert's hospital bed 6 years earlier, holding his hand while he made her promise not to turn the rest of her life into a memorial. He had known her better than their children ever realized. Margaret removed her reading glasses and placed them carefully on the table. Thomas began to rise, but she stopped him with a glance. She did not need defending. Not here. Not in her own home. Daniel, she said, her voice so controlled that Claire looked up immediately. Take your folder. Daniel swallowed. Mom, I did not mean it like that. Claire, take your purse. Claire's eyes filled. Please, can we just calm down? Margaret walked to the front door and opened it. Cold air entered the hallway. She looked at the two adults she had spent most of her life loving, protecting, and forgiving. Get out of my house. Daniel stared at her. Mom. You came here believing my age gave you authority over my judgment. You questioned my mind, my money, and the man I love. Then you used your dead father to shame me because I would not surrender. Her voice never rose. It did not need to. This conversation is over. Claire stood first. Daniel slowly gathered the papers. At the doorway, he turned as though expecting Margaret to soften. She did not. The door closed behind them. Margaret stood motionless for several seconds. Then her shoulders dropped, and the tears finally came. Thomas approached quietly. Margaret. She wiped her face and looked toward the cream-colored box waiting on the writing desk. Something inside her had broken that morning, but it was not her resolve. It was the last belief that she needed her children's approval to begin again. For several minutes after the door closed, Margaret stood in the hallway with tears on her face and one hand resting against the wall. Thomas did not tell her everything would be fine. He did not tell her Daniel had spoken out of anger or that Claire would eventually understand. He simply waited until Margaret was ready to move. That was one of the things she loved about him. He never treated silence as an emergency. Finally, Margaret returned to the living room and sat beside him. I keep hearing what Daniel said about Robert, she whispered. Thomas looked down at his hands. I know. Robert would not be ashamed. I know that too. Margaret closed her eyes. 6 years earlier, during one of Robert's final weeks at home, he had asked her to sit beside him after Daniel and Claire left for the evening. His voice had been tired, but his meaning had been unmistakable. He told her not to spend whatever years remained proving how much she had loved him by refusing to live without him. At the time, Margaret had cried and told him not to talk that way. Now she finally understood why he had insisted. Robert had not been giving her permission to move on. He had been reminding her that she already possessed it. Margaret opened her eyes and looked toward the writing desk. The cream-colored box seemed almost brighter beneath the lamp. She stood. Thomas watched her cross the room. What are you doing? Margaret lifted the lid. Inside, The invitations were arranged in neat rows, each envelope bearing a name in dark blue script. Finishing what we started. Thomas rose slowly. Margaret, if you want to postpone this, I will understand. She turned toward him. Do you want to postpone it? No. Neither do I. She carried the box to the dining table. For the next hour, Margaret went through every envelope. Some names made her smile. Her college roommate, Susan Miller, who had remained her friend for nearly 50 years. Her former neighbor, Patricia Collins, who brought soup every Wednesday after Robert died. Thomas's sister, Rebecca. Friends from church. Former co-workers. Couples they had met together. People who had celebrated their happiness without asking what it might cost them. Then Margaret reached Daniel's envelope. Beneath it was Claire's. Her fingers stopped. Thomas sat across from her. You do not have to decide tonight. Margaret looked at the two names. That is the problem. I have spent too much of my life making decisions around everyone else's comfort. She placed Daniel's envelope to one side, then Claire's beside it. Thomas frowned slightly. Are you removing them? No. Margaret opened a drawer and took out 2 blank cards. I am changing what their invitations mean. She wrote slowly, carefully, without anger. When she finished, she slid one card into Daniel's envelope and the other into Claire's. Thomas did not ask what she had written. He trusted her enough to wait. Margaret then opened her laptop. There was one more matter to settle. Earlier that year, before Thomas had even proposed, they had separately met with attorneys because both had adult children and both understood how quickly money could poison a family. Thomas had his own retirement savings, investments, and proceeds from selling his home. Margaret had her house, Robert's retirement assets, and investments accumulated over decades. Their plan had always been simple: a prenuptial agreement, separate premarital property, and clear estate documents protecting both families. Daniel and Claire had never bothered to ask. Margaret sent an email to her attorney confirming that she wanted the documents finalized before the ceremony. Then she closed the laptop. Thomas finally spoke. Are you trying to prove something to them? Margaret shook her head. No. I am making sure they cannot hide behind money anymore. She looked at the envelopes. If they object after they understand that you are not taking their inheritance, then we will finally know what this was really about. On Monday morning, Margaret drove 3 miles to the post office. The clerk weighed the stack and told her the postage. Margaret paid, then stood beside the blue collection slot with the invitations in her hands. For one brief second, she imagined taking Daniel's and Claire's envelopes home. She imagined another conversation, another attempt to persuade them, another week spent defending a decision that belonged to her. Then she remembered their laughter. She remembered the folder. She remembered Daniel speaking for a father who could no longer correct him. Margaret dropped the invitations into the slot. The sound was small. Almost nothing. Yet as she walked back toward her car, she felt lighter than she had in days. Across town, Daniel still believed his mother would reconsider. Claire still believed Saturday had frightened Margaret into slowing down. Neither understood that Margaret had stopped asking herself whether her children approved. The only question left was what they would do when her answer arrived in their mailbox. The first invitation reached Claire on Wednesday afternoon. She found the cream-colored envelope between a utility bill and a department store catalog, and the moment she recognized her mother's handwriting, she stopped halfway through the kitchen. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. She had expected a telephone call. Maybe an apology for Saturday. Maybe an admission that everything had moved too quickly. Instead, Margaret had sent stationery. Claire opened the envelope and pulled out the invitation. The paper was thick, ivory, understated. Margaret Whitmore and Thomas Bennett requested the pleasure of their family and friends at their wedding 6 weeks from Saturday at a restored Stone Inn outside Lancaster. Claire read the date twice. The venue was booked. The ceremony had a time. This was not an idea anymore. Then a smaller card slipped onto the counter. Claire picked it up. Margaret had written the message by hand. This is an invitation, not a request for permission. Come if you can celebrate with us. If you cannot, I will respect your decision, but you must respect mine. Claire sat down. There was no accusation. Somehow, that made it harder to dismiss. Her telephone rang 3 minutes later. Daniel. You got one too? He asked. Claire looked at the card. Yes. She actually sent them. Apparently. Daniel sounded irritated. This is unbelievable. After Saturday, she just went ahead with it. Claire stared at the word celebrate. Daniel, what did you think she was going to do? Think about what we said. Maybe she did. Silence. Daniel finally said, I am calling her. Do not. Why? Because you are angry she did not obey us, and that is not the same thing as being worried about her. Daniel went quiet. Claire surprised herself with the words. Before he could answer, another envelope arrived across town at Emily's apartment. Emily opened hers standing beside the mailbox, smiled so widely that her neighbor asked what had happened, and immediately sent Margaret a message. I will be there. Front row if you let me. Margaret read it while sitting beside Thomas in her attorney's office. On the polished table before them rested the documents Daniel and Claire had never asked to see. Margaret's premarital assets would remain hers. Thomas's assets would remain his. Their estate plans would protect their respective children and grandchildren. Thomas had even requested language making it clear that he would make no claim against Margaret's house if she died before him. Margaret's attorney, Janet Reynolds, adjusted her glasses. This is unusually straightforward. You both came into the relationship financially independent. Thomas smiled. That was never the complicated part. Margaret's telephone buzzed again. This time it was Daniel. She let it ring. A voicemail appeared moments later. She listened outside the office. Mom, I received the invitation. We need to talk before this goes any further. Margaret deleted nothing. She simply put the telephone back into her purse. By Friday, responses began arriving. Susan Miller accepted. Patricia Collins accepted. Thomas's sister Rebecca accepted. Old co-workers, neighbors, and friends sent warm messages. Nobody asked Margaret whether 68 was too old for vows. Nobody asked whether a wedding would look ridiculous. They asked what color she planned to wear, whether Thomas was nervous, and whether there would be dancing. Each ordinary question exposed how abnormal her children's reaction had been. Sunday evening, Claire came to Margaret's house alone. Margaret opened the door but did not immediately invite her inside. Claire held the invitation against her coat. I want to ask you something. Then ask. Claire swallowed. Is Thomas going to inherit the house? Margaret studied her daughter's face. Would the answer change whether you believe I deserve to marry him? Claire looked down. I do not know. Then money was never the real question. Margaret stepped aside and let her enter. At the dining table, she placed copies of the legal documents in front of Claire. Claire read silently. Her expression changed line by line. Thomas was not taking the house. He was not taking Robert's retirement assets. He was not positioning himself to control Margaret's estate. The entire fear Claire and Daniel had built their argument around disappeared in 10 pages of legal language. Claire slowly lowered the papers. Why did you not tell us? Margaret met her eyes. Because you never asked what I had planned. You only told me what you thought I was incapable of planning. Claire had no answer. Margaret reached across the table and touched the invitation. Now you know Thomas is not marrying me for my money. Her voice softened, but not enough to rescue Claire from the truth. So whatever problem you still have with this wedding belongs to you. It does not belong to me. 6 weeks later, Margaret stood in a quiet bridal room at the Stone Inn outside Lancaster while late afternoon sunlight spilled through tall windows and turned the hardwood floor gold. She wore an ivory tea-length dress with long sleeves, simple pearl earrings, and the same calm expression she had worn the morning she mailed the invitations. Outside, nearly every chair was filled. Susan Miller had flown in from Florida. Patricia Collins sat beside Thomas's sister Rebecca. Former co-workers, neighbors, friends from church, and people Margaret had known for decades filled the room with warm conversation. Emily had arrived an hour early and insisted on helping with everything, even though Margaret had told her repeatedly that there was nothing left to organize. Yet 2 chairs in the front row remained empty. Small white cards rested against their backs. Daniel Whitmore. Claire Whitmore. Margaret had not removed the cards. She had not moved the chairs to the back. She had not asked anyone else to sit there. Thomas found her standing near the doorway, looking toward them. "We can wait a few minutes," he said softly. Margaret shook her head. "No. Are you sure? I spent 6 weeks deciding that my happiness would not depend on whether those chairs were occupied." Thomas offered his hand. Margaret took it. "Then we start on time." At 4 o'clock, the music began. Guests turned toward the aisle. Emily stood near the front, her eyes already shining. Margaret stepped forward alone. She had been asked whether Daniel would walk her down the aisle, but she had declined before anyone knew whether he would attend. At 68, she did not need to be given away. She was choosing where she wanted to go. One step. Then another. The empty chairs remained in her peripheral vision, but she refused to let them become larger than the people who had shown up. Halfway down the aisle, Margaret heard the old wooden doors open behind her. A murmur moved through the guests. She stopped. Claire stood in the doorway, slightly breathless, wearing a navy dress beneath a light gray coat. She was alone. For a moment, mother and daughter simply looked at each other across the room. Claire's face carried none of the certainty she had worn 6 weeks earlier. She walked forward slowly until she reached Margaret. "Mom." Margaret waited. Claire looked toward the front row. "Is my seat still there?" The question was barely above a whisper. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. She could have demanded an apology. She could have reminded Claire of every cruel assumption, every question about money, every moment she had been treated like someone whose judgment had expired. Instead, Margaret looked at the empty chair. It always was. Claire's eyes filled. "I am sorry." Margaret nodded once. "We will talk later." It was not instant forgiveness. It was something more honest. A door left open, with a boundary standing beside it. Claire took her seat next to the empty chair bearing Daniel's name. Margaret continued down the aisle. Thomas waited beneath an arch of white roses and autumn greenery, his expression warm and steady. When Margaret reached him, he whispered, "You look beautiful." She smiled. "You look nervous." "I am 70 years old. I have earned the right." Margaret laughed, and the room laughed with her. The ceremony was simple. No grand promises about forever, as though time had not already taught them better. They promised companionship, patience, honesty, and gratitude for whatever years life gave them. When they exchanged rings, Claire quietly wiped her eyes. Emily reached over and held her mother's hand. Daniel's chair stayed empty. At the reception, nobody mentioned it until Margaret stepped outside for a moment of quiet. Claire followed. "He wanted me to stay home," she said. Margaret looked across the grounds, where strings of lights glowed above the patio. "Daniel?" Claire nodded. "He said coming here meant admitting we were wrong." Margaret turned toward her daughter. "And what do you think?" Claire took a long breath. "I think we were wrong before we ever knew anything about Thomas. We decided you needed protecting because it was easier than admitting you had a life we were not in charge of." Margaret said nothing. Claire continued. "I kept telling myself I was worried about losing Dad. But Dad was already gone. What scared me was that you were moving forward, and I had gotten comfortable believing you would always stay exactly where I left you." Margaret's expression softened. Thank you for saying that. Claire looked toward the reception. I do not expect everything to be normal tonight. Good, Margaret said gently. Because respect comes before normal. Claire nodded. Inside, the band began another song. Thomas appeared at the doorway but did not interrupt. Margaret smiled at him, then turned back toward Claire. Come inside. There is cake. Claire laughed through her tears. They walked back together. The empty chair remained where it had been all afternoon, but Margaret no longer looked at it. For the first time, Daniel's absence felt like his decision instead of her rejection. And as Thomas held out his hand for their first dance, Margaret understood that the most important person who had finally shown up for her life was Margaret herself. 3 days after the wedding, Margaret was standing in her kitchen unpacking a wedding gift when her telephone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. She watched it ring twice before answering. Hello, Daniel. His voice was quieter than she remembered. Mom. Can we talk? Margaret set the gift box on the counter. Thomas was in the backyard checking a loose gate latch, giving her the kind of ordinary morning she had once believed belonged only to younger couples. We are talking. Daniel exhaled. I heard Claire went to the wedding. She did. Emily sent me a picture. Margaret waited. Daniel seemed to expect anger, perhaps even relief that he had finally called. She gave him neither. You looked happy, he said. I was. Another silence followed. I almost came. Margaret looked through the window at Thomas. But you did not. I was angry. I know. I thought if I showed up, it meant I was admitting everything I said was wrong. Margaret's voice remained even. Were you wrong? Daniel did not answer immediately. Some of it. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. There was the old Daniel, negotiating even when truth required no bargain. Which part was right? She asked. I was worried about you. Concern was not the problem. You were allowed to ask questions. You were not allowed to decide that my age made your answers more important than mine. Daniel went quiet. Margaret continued. You asked about my house before you asked whether Thomas was kind to me. You investigated his property before you asked whether I was happy. You brought papers into my home and suggested managing my money. Then you used your father to shame me. I should not have said that. No. You should not have. His voice softened. I miss Dad. Margaret felt the anger inside her loosen, but it did not disappear. So do I. Every day. Loving Thomas did not erase your father. Happiness is not an act of betrayal. Daniel breathed slowly into the telephone. Claire said you had legal documents already prepared. We did. So Thomas never wanted the house. Margaret looked down at her wedding ring. Thomas owns his own future. I own mine. We chose to share our lives, not consume each other's assets. Daniel gave a small, embarrassed laugh. I really made a mess of this. Yes, you did. Margaret said it without cruelty. Sometimes truth did not need decoration. Can I come over? He asked. Margaret paused. Not today. The answer surprised him. Mom, I am trying. And I appreciate that. But trying does not mean everything returns to normal because you are uncomfortable with the consequences. Daniel was silent. Then when? When you are ready to talk to me as your mother, not manage me as your responsibility. She heard him take a breath. That is fair. It is necessary. They ended the call without a dramatic reconciliation, but Margaret did not feel disappointed. For most of her life, she had believed love meant keeping every door open no matter how people entered. Age had taught her something different. A door could remain open while still having a threshold. Later that afternoon, Claire arrived with Emily carrying leftover wedding cake and 3 paper cups of coffee. Thomas brought plates to the porch, and the 4 of them sat beneath the same roof where he had proposed months earlier. Claire asked about the honeymoon they were planning for Charleston in the spring. Emily teased Thomas about his dancing. Margaret laughed until her cheeks hurt. Nobody asked what people would think. Nobody mentioned inheritance. Nobody treated her future like a family emergency. A week later, a card arrived in the mail. Margaret recognized Daniel's handwriting. Inside was a short message. He wrote that he was sorry he had confused fear with love and control with protection. He said he hoped, when she was ready, that he could take Margaret and Thomas to dinner. Margaret read the card twice and placed it on the mantel beside a wedding photograph. She did not call immediately. Forgiveness, she had learned, did not have to race ahead of healing. That evening, Thomas found her on the porch watching the last orange light fade behind the trees. "Any regrets?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "About marrying you? About choosing yourself." She thought about the laughter at the dinner table, the blue folder, the invitations, Claire standing in the doorway, and Daniel's empty chair. Then she looked at the man beside her. "I spent years believing being a good mother meant making my life fit around everyone else's," she said. "I was wrong." Thomas took her hand. Margaret looked toward the darkening sky. At 68, she had not married because she was afraid of growing old alone. She had married because she finally understood that growing older did not make her life belong to her children. Love had no retirement age, dignity had no expiration date, and a woman did not lose the right to choose her own future simply because her children had grown comfortable believing her best years were behind her. Margaret's life was still hers. And this time, she intended to live it that way.